This story begins on a bright April morning in 1988, when the passengers of Aloha Airlines Flight 243 boarded their plane for what was supposed to be a short and routine flight across the Hawaiian Islands. The Boeing 737 had made thousands of flights before, ferrying people between islands, connecting families, and serving tourists eager to see the paradise of Hawaii. Nobody could have imagined that this ordinary flight would soon become one of the most terrifying and extraordinary moments in aviation history. At first, everything seemed normal. Passengers chatted, some looked out at the clear blue skies, and the crew carried out their duties with the usual calm professionalism. The aircraft climbed steadily to its cruising altitude of 24,000 feet. But hidden in the skin of the airplane was a silent danger. Years of flying in salty ocean air had caused unseen cracks and corrosion. With each pressurization and depressurization cycle, the stress on the fuselage grew, slowly weakening the metal. Then, in an instant, disaster struck. At 1:48 p.m., with a deafening roar, a massive section of the roof above the cabin suddenly ripped away. A 14-foot section of the fuselage was torn open as though the plane had been unzipped. The calm chatter inside the cabin turned into chaos and screams. The sky was no longer outside the windows, it was above the passengers' heads. The rushing wind howled like a storm, tearing through the cabin, scattering debris, and making it nearly impossible to breathe. Passengers clung desperately to their seats, their hair and clothes whipping in the wind, their eyes wide with terror. Some thought this was the end, that there was no way a plane could survive with its roof gone. The sound was so loud that people could barely hear each other. The cabin crew fought to stay on their feet, trying to calm passengers while holding on for their own lives. In the cockpit, Captain Robert Schornsteimer and First Officer Madeline Tompkins were suddenly confronted with the unimaginable. Warning lights flashed, alarms blared, and the roar of the rushing air made communication almost impossible. The airplane shook violently, yet it was still flying. Despite the gaping hole, the engines kept running, and the wings held strong. The captain immediately took control, fighting to stabilize the aircraft. Meanwhile, the passengers tried to comprehend what was happening. Some closed their eyes and prayed. Others held hands with strangers, united by the fear that they would not survive. One flight attendant, Clarabelle Lansing, who had been standing near the rupture when it happened, was instantly sucked out of the aircraft, disappearing into the open sky. Her loss was devastating, but the rest of the crew knew they had to continue to fight for the lives of everyone still aboard. The pilots had to make rapid decisions. They were losing altitude, and the structure of the plane was compromised. They couldn't climb higher, the cabin was open to the sky, and oxygen masks dangled uselessly because there was no sealed air left to breathe in. They had to descend quickly to a safe altitude where passengers could survive without pressurization. With remarkable skill, the pilots guided the crippled plane downward, aiming for the nearest runway on Maui. Inside the cabin, the scene was surreal. The wind was so intense that people struggled to keep their eyes open. Some passengers described it later as sitting in a convertible car at 500 miles per hour, only far more terrifying. Yet amid the chaos, the crew moved among the passengers, checking seatbelts, urging people to stay calm, and making sure nobody was in immediate danger of being pulled from their seats. Their courage in those moments kept the situation from spiraling into total panic. As the plane descended, the pilots faced another challenge. The structure of the airplane had been severely weakened, and there was no guarantee it would hold together long enough to land. Every second felt like a gamble. The airframe groaned under the stress, and pieces of insulation flapped wildly in the open air. Passengers could see the ocean below, a frightening reminder of what would happen if the plane came apart before reaching the runway. Yet, through extraordinary skill and calm determination, the pilots lined up for an emergency landing at Kahului Airport. The control tower had already been alerted, and emergency vehicles were waiting. The crippled plane, its roof ripped away, descended over the island, visible to stunned onlookers on the ground who could hardly believe what they were seeing. Inside, passengers braced themselves. Many believed the landing would be their final moments. Some cried, others whispered prayers, and many just held on as tightly as they could. The pilots touched the plane down on the runway, and the aircraft screeched along the pavement. With tremendous skill, they managed to bring the plane to a stop. Against all odds, the flight had landed safely. As the engines wound down, the cabin was filled with stunned silence, broken only by sobs of relief. Emergency crews rushed to the aircraft, helping passengers off the plane, many of them barefoot because they had lost shoes in the violent decompression. People stumbled onto the runway, kissed the ground, and embraced each other, thankful to be alive. Out of the 95 people on board, only one life had been lost, that of flight attendant Clarabelle Lansing. Her sacrifice and the bravery of her fellow crew members became a lasting part of aviation history. The rest of the passengers, though shaken and injured, had survived an event that many believed was unsurvivable. In the days that followed, investigators examined the aircraft and discovered the cause of the accident: metal fatigue. Tiny cracks in the fuselage, caused by years of pressurization cycles, had slowly grown until the structure could no longer hold together. The salty air of Hawaii had accelerated the corrosion, and inspections had failed to detect the hidden danger. This tragedy changed aviation forever. Airlines and regulators around the world tightened safety procedures. Inspections for metal fatigue became far more rigorous, especially for older aircraft that had flown thousands of short routes. Engineers redesigned maintenance programs to ensure that such a catastrophic failure would never happen again. The lessons learned from Flight 243 saved countless lives in the years that followed. But beyond the technical details, what stands out most is the incredible courage shown that day. The pilots who kept their focus under impossible conditions, the flight attendants who moved among terrified passengers, risking their own lives to keep others safe, and the passengers themselves, who endured a nightmare at 24,000 feet and lived to tell the tale. Stories like this remind us how fragile life can be, but also how strong the human spirit is when faced with the unthinkable. An airplane lost its roof at 24,000 feet, but because of skill, courage, and determination, nearly everyone survived. What happened next was not just a disaster, it was a miracle of survival that will never be forgotten. This is why Aloha Airlines Flight 243 remains one of the most remarkable survival stories in aviation history. It shows us that even in the face of disaster, hope, skill, and courage can prevail. And that's the story of the airplane that lost its roof at 24,000 feet, and what happened next.